4 in the morning. London, 1555. A cart rolls over wet cobblestone, the only sound in a city pretending to be asleep. Behind shuttered windows, families lie awake in the dark, because tonight being seen awake means being suspected of something. By dawn, a crowd fills the square. They haven't come out of hatred. They've come because they were ordered to. A stake, a pile of kindling, a man on his knees, lips moving in silent prayer. The torch drops, and in a palace not far away, a queen kneels too, praying for the exact same thing this man is dying for. The soul of England. History gave her one name, and it stuck. Not Mary I, not Queen of England and Ireland. Bloody Mary. 470 years later, the name still lands like an accusation. But almost nobody asks the harder question, what if the woman behind it wasn't a monster at all, but one of the most betrayed, isolated women ever crowned in English history? Tonight, we're not just covering what Mary Tudor did. We're going to dig into why, and by the end, you may not see her the same way again. It starts in a nursery, long before the fires, long before the name. February 18th, 1516. Greenwich Palace. Church bells ring out across the Thames. A princess has been born. Mary, daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess turned English queen. Henry had prayed for a son. He got a daughter instead. For a while, remarkably, that didn't seem to matter. Mary was adored. Foreign ambassadors wrote home in astonishment. By 9 years old, she could reportedly hold a conversation in fluent Latin. She played the virginals. She studied philosophy, theology, geography, as though she were being trained to rule, not simply to marry. At one banquet, Henry is said to have lifted her onto the table so visiting dignitaries could admire her, like something precious he wanted the whole room to see. For a moment in time, Mary Tudor was the most valuable child in England. But underneath the admiration sat a fault line. One word Henry couldn't get past. Daughter. What happened next didn't just cost Mary her status at court, it cost her her mother. It put her faith on trial. And it planted something in her, a conviction so deep it would one day set a country on fire. In a few minutes, we'll look at the actual document, one still preserved today, that stripped a teenage princess of her own name overnight. It's one of the coldest paper trails in royal history, but to understand it, you first need to understand the man who signed it. By the late 1520s, Henry VIII had convinced himself of something dangerous, that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was cursed by God, since it had failed to give him a surviving son. He'd also fallen for a sharp, ambitious woman at court, Anne Boleyn. To marry her, Henry needed Rome to annul his first marriage. Rome said no. So Henry did something almost unthinkable for the era. He tore England away from the Catholic Church entirely and crowned himself its new head. Textbooks call it the English Reformation, one of the great hinge points of European history. Inside the palace, for one 18-year-old girl, it wasn't history. It was demolition. Mary's parents' marriage was declared void. Overnight, the girl once shown off to foreign courts as England's heir was reclassified, officially, on paper, as illegitimate. Her title vanished. She was ordered to call herself simply Lady Mary. She was torn from her mother and never permitted to see her again before Catherine died alone in a cold, half-abandoned manor house far from court. Officials pressed Mary to sign a statement admitting her parents' marriage had been unlawful and accepting Anne Boleyn as the true queen. She refused, for as long as refusing didn't get her killed. Under mounting threats, most historians believe she eventually signed under pressure just to survive. But privately, she never let it go. She still believed, to her core, that she was Henry VIII's only legitimate child and a devout Catholic, standing alone in a country turning Protestant beneath her feet. That refusal to bend is the thread that runs through everything Mary would become. Years passed. Anne Boleyn, the woman who replaced Mary's mother, was executed on the king's own orders in 1536. Henry married 4 more times. Somewhere in the chaos, Mary was quietly restored to the line of succession, though never fully trusted, never fully forgiven. When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, the crown passed to his only surviving legitimate son, 9-year-old Edward VI. Edward had been raised a committed Protestant, and under his regents, England swung hard away from Catholic tradition. Catholic imagery was stripped from churches. The Latin Mass was outlawed. For Mary, watching her country abandon the faith she'd nearly died defending must have felt like living through the same betrayal all over again. Then, in 1553, Edward, just 15, fell gravely ill. And England stood on the edge of a crisis that could have erased Mary from the throne entirely. What happened in the days after Edward's death is barely taught in schools. A secret plot, a teenage rival for the crown, and a 9-day reign that ends with a beheading. Mary's story is about to get darker before it gets better. As Edward VI lay dying, the nobles closest to him panicked. If Mary took the throne, she'd restore Catholicism and undo everything they'd spent years building. So they moved first. They convinced the dying king to name a different heir, Lady Jane Grey, his 16-year-old cousin and a committed Protestant. When Edward died in July 1553, Jane was proclaimed queen. But the plotters miscalculated one thing: the will of ordinary people. England didn't want Jane. They wanted Mary, the rightful heir by blood. Mary fled to East Anglia, gathered supporters, and rallied thousands to her cause. One by one, the nobles who'd backed Jane began abandoning ship. Almost unbelievably, without a single major battle, the plot collapsed from the inside. Jane's reign lasted 9 days. She and several of her allies were later executed, a bitter irony, given the nickname history would eventually hang around Mary's neck instead. Church bells rang across London, crowds cheered in the streets. For one brief, shining moment, Mary Tudor's story looked like it might become a triumphant one, a wronged princess, finally restored, beloved by her people. Nobody in that cheering crowd had any idea what was coming next. To Mary, taking the throne wasn't just a political win, it was proof. She believed, with total sincerity, that God himself had placed her there for one purpose: to drag England's soul back to the Catholic Church. At first, the changes were procedural. Catholic churches reopened. England reconciled with Rome. Protestant bishops lost their positions. Tense, but bloodless. Then, in 1555, Parliament revived England's old heresy laws. Under these laws, anyone who refused to renounce Protestantism could be tried, and if convicted, burned alive at the stake. The first executions shocked the country. Most assumed they'd stay rare, a warning, not a policy. They were wrong. The burnings continued, month after month, year after year. Farmers, weavers, elderly widows, teenagers who'd barely lived. By the end of Mary's 5-year reign, close to 280 Protestants had been burned alive for their faith, one of the highest tallies of religious executions in English history, compressed into an unusually short window of time. Witnesses recorded prisoners praying out loud as the flames climbed. Some reportedly forgave the men lighting the fire. Others screamed in agony that haunted the crowds who watched for the rest of their lives. And here's the twist historians still point to. The burnings didn't crush Protestant resistance, they multiplied it. People who might have quietly gone along instead watched their neighbors die rather than recant, and it hardened them instead of breaking them. Mary had, without meaning to, created martyrs. And martyrs don't stay silent. They get written about. One writer in particular would take these stories and turn them into the most damaging piece of anti-Mary propaganda ever printed. A book so widely read, it sat for a queen whose whole legacy depended on producing an heir. It must have felt like a final, cruel joke from a life that had rarely shown her any mercy. By 1558, Mary's health was collapsing. She was only 42. On November 17th, 1558, she died, quietly, some accounts say almost peacefully, at St. James's Palace. Her half-sister, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, took the throne. Within a few short years, England swung back to Protestantism, and most of Mary's religious reforms were undone nearly as fast as she'd built them. But the fires stayed in public memory. A Protestant writer named John Foxe later gathered the stories of Mary's victims into what's now known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, vivid, emotional, and built to be unforgettable. For the next 3 centuries, it became one of the most widely read books in the English language. Generation after generation of English schoolchildren grew up on those pages. The nickname stuck for good: Bloody Mary. Meanwhile, her genuine accomplishments, becoming England's first queen to rule in her own right, stabilizing the currency, reorganizing the navy, laying groundwork later Tudor monarchs would quietly build on, got buried under one unforgettable nickname. Here's the part almost nobody mentions. Mary was far from the only English monarch to execute people over religion. Her father, Henry VIII, executed both Catholics and Protestants who defied him. Her half-sister, Elizabeth I, remembered far more kindly by history, later executed Catholics for treason tied directly to their faith, and over her much longer reign, the numbers crept toward similarly grim territory. Religious killing wasn't a Mary Tudor invention. It was, tragically, standard practice across almost all of 16th century Europe. What made Mary's name uniquely dark wasn't necessarily the scale of what she did. It was that the side she lost to ended up writing the history books, and they wrote about her in searing, unforgettable detail. So, tyrant or a grieving, devout woman convinced she was saving souls? Maybe the honest answer lives somewhere in between. Mary Tudor was a daughter rejected by her own father, a princess stripped of her title as a teenager, a queen surrounded by nobles who plotted against her from the very first week of her reign, a wife humiliated in public by pregnancies that never came to be, and yes, a ruler whose convictions cost hundreds of people their lives. History rarely hands us clean villains or clean heroes. It hands us people, wounded, complicated, human. And maybe that's exactly why, nearly 500 years later, we're still trying to understand the woman underneath the name Bloody Mary. If this pulled you into Tudor history the way it pulled me in while researching it, hit subscribe, drop a comment below. Do you think history judged Mary fairly, or did the legend of Bloody Mary bury the real woman underneath it?